Hello, class. Welcome to this lecture on the book of Daniel. By the way, his name means God is judge. We see a timeline. On this timeline, we see Daniel was taken to Babylon in 605 BC when Nebuchadnezzar after defeating the Egyptians, came to Jerusalem and took a bunch of captives back to, he conquered, beginning to conquer Judah, and took Daniel and other captives back to Babylon. We see there were actually three different times that Nebuchadnezzar did that. He did the first one in 605, as I just mentioned. In 597, he also did it again, sent some armies down there and took back 10,000 Jews, of which Ezekiel was one of them. And then in the final one, when he utterly destroyed the temple in the city of Jerusalem, 587, 586. And you can read about how bad that is in Lamentations. And here's a map of the days of Daniel of Babylon and the Medes and the Persians, and who eventually conquered the Babylonians. Authorship, critical scholarship says they question whether Daniel could have written this. I believe we have very good reasons as a conservative to believe, because I have a high view of Scripture. Those are critical of it they do not hold to the high view of divine inspiration or inerrancy. So here's the reasons that I have. Daniel claimed to be the author in chapter 7, verse 1, and chapter 12, verse 4. So that's close enough. That's good enough for me. But also that's not, we got more than that. Ezekiel was he was taken captive too, even though he didn't live the same place Daniel did. The reputation of Daniel spread. He wrote about Daniel and his prophecy in chapter 14. And so we have that reference that confirms it. And then finally, Jesus confirmed it, and his words are recorded by Matthew and by Mark that Daniel was a prophet. So that's pretty strong evidence, internal evidence about Daniel. What was his place in the canon? Well, if you look at the English translation, he was after Ezekiel, but the Hebrew Bible has different structure. It's structured the law, the prophets, and the writings. Well, Daniel is not, even though he is a prophet, was not included in the writings. I guess we can conjecture maybe because Daniel didn't publicly speak to the nation of Israel when he was in Babylon. Actually, he was a high government official for the Babylonians, for Nebuchadnezzar. But at any rate, that's where it stands in the Hebrew Bible. The personal life of Daniel, well, little is known about his life. We know what little we do know. He came from a royal family. It was of noble birth. He was probably quite young when he was taken captive in 605, but he was, we know, strong, a handsome fella, and smart, or else Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have had him such a high official in his reign. We also know that he lived to be an old man, because in chapter 10 of Daniel, we know that Cyrus, the king of Persia at the time, in his third year, he was still alive. Daniel was. So he lived, if he was 16 when he was taken captive in 605, and he lived Cyrus's third year, then he must have been somewhere around 65. That's an estimate. Literary form, well, it's apocalyptic literature, which is Daniel is, and we to describe it comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, and it has here the characteristics of apocalyptic literature. The person who received these visions recorded what they saw, which Daniel did, and in the New Testament, John in the Revelation did, and wrote down what they saw, and it's highly symbolic. That's just part of what apocalyptic literature is. And it normally gives a great deal of information about God's plan for the nation of Israel and their future. Apocalyptic literature is prose rather than poetry, which it separates it from other prophetic writings. The apocalyptic is so symbolic and is written in prose. When you interpret apocalyptic literature, it's important not to be subjective with these symbolic symbols. Most of the time, it's interpreted for you. The angels interpreted it for Daniel. He wrote down what the angel said it meant. And if not, like in maybe parts of Revelation as well, you can look at the symbolism in other places and see what it symbolized there and get that helps. It's very helpful. So use scripture to come up with an objective meaning. Excuse me. The book of Daniel is unique in that it was written in two languages, both Hebrew and in Aramaic. All of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2 is in Hebrew. Chapters 8 through 12 is in Hebrew, but the remaining verse 4 in chapter 2 through the end of chapter 7 is in Aramaic. And so we see 2:4 through 7:28 is really a program for the Gentiles, while the part that's written in Hebrew is for how the Gentiles influence Israel as a people. Let's look at the history of how Babylon got to where they were in the days of Daniel. You go to back Genesis chapter 10, you see Nimrod 2,300 years before Christ was the founder. Going through history, we see Nineveh was destroyed by a collation of kings, Cyaxares of the Mede, Nabopolassar of Babylon, and a king of the Scythians. And after they destroyed Nineveh, the land was divided up among those. So we see the Neo-Babylonian Empire was born here. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. Nebuchadnezzar came along after this in history. He was son of a king, Nabopolassar. And he, in one of his wars against the king Pharaoh of Egypt in 605 that we mentioned earlier, conquered the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt. But after that, he, in the same year, went up to Jerusalem and actually conquered and took captive the Judah and from Jerusalem, and took captives, and Daniel was among those. That's whether Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And of course, these other backgrounds I've already covered. The second armies went down in 597, 98 again. Took Ezekiel that time, and then a third trip when they eventually completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. As you can read about how bad it was in Lamentations that Jeremiah wrote. Why was the book written? First of all, Daniel was in a position to protect the Jewish people who had been taken captive and were in a pagan land, the Babylonians. But he also was a good example. He did not compromise his Jewish religion, and was a good how you should live among pagans, not be an idolater for sure. The book also is important because it shows that God is sovereign over the Gentiles. He sets up Gentile kings, and he takes them down as well. It gives how God's faithful to his covenant people. The Jews, he still preserved them even though they had been conquered by the Babylonians, but he kept his covenant promises that he would He had as many that had not been fulfilled yet, but due to their disobedience, that God allowed them to be conquered. And in fact, he even predicted they would be. But way back in Deuteronomy, Moses wrote that in Deuteronomy chapter 28 when they first went into the promise. When they first entered, Moses didn't go, but he told them when they went in, you better not go into idolatry. God's going to take you out of the land. Another is to show the times of the Gentiles, giving you a history of what the Jews would experience when they were not autonomous anymore, but lived under the empires of Gentile empires. Here we see the importance of this book. It bridges the gap between Israel's historical books and the New Testament. And so it gives you a prophecy yet future from Daniel's time of the kingdoms and empires that would come after him up to the time of Christ and to the New Testament time. But also it goes beyond that and gives you prophecies about eschatology, about the end of time. And so that's why it's very important. So it's very important to understand Daniel so you can understand end-time events, and particularly the book of Revelation. Here's the outline. You see the personal history of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there in chapter 1. Then important. In chapters 2 through 7, you see a history of the Gentiles during the times of the Gentiles. But yet in chapters 9 through 12, you see a history of Israel during the times of the Gentiles. So there's that distinction. Now, I don't have time to read through this. This is chapter 2 gives you Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He had a dream of this in his dream an image of a man, a head of gold, made of different metals, of silver, down in his breast area, then down his torso. You had bronze, and then you had iron. And all those represented empires, and he demanded that somebody tell him what that meant. Daniel prayed, and he was given the interpretation, and here we have it written here down at the end of chapter 2, of what I gave you a summary of just now. Daniel himself had a dream in chapter 7 of 4 beasts, and the interpretation of them is the same as the interpretation of the image in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had of the image of 4 metals. They all represented coming empires of the times of the Gentiles. And so here I want you to see in this slide a summary of those 2 chapters and those 2 dreams and those 2 images. They were symbolic of coming empires. And so Daniel 2, the chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the head of gold, and in his vision was the Babylonian Empire. He said, hey, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Daniel's dream was the first beast that he saw in chapter 7, and that dream, it was the same, Babylonian Empire. So you see how they represented coming empires. The second image, the silver of that image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, represented the Medes and the Persians, and they did conquer the Babylonians. The second beast that Daniel saw in chapter 7, that beast conquered the Babylonians. That's the next empire. The third empire that would succeed that one was the torso in chapter 2 of that image that Nebuchadnezzar saw of the bronze. Well, the third beast that Daniel saw in chapter 7 was also, both of them represented the Greek Empire, the Hellenistic Empire. And then the next empire that came after that, the 4th metal on that image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in chapter 2, the iron was the Roman Empire. The fourth beast that Daniel saw was the Roman Empire. And excuse me, and then the stone in chapter 2, excuse me, and Daniel, what he saw in chapter 7 represented Jesus coming to set up his messianic kingdom, which would be an everlasting kingdom. All these other kingdoms were temporary. Somebody else succeeded them. Okay? And so I wanted you to see that on this slide. And then finally, as we look at this list, I'm not going to read it. I don't have time. The 77s, you see the Greek, the translation in English is 70 weeks here in verse 24. Really, the Hebrew word means 77s, periods of sevens. Well, those periods of seven represent not 7 days or 7 weeks, it represents 7 years. 70 periods of 7 years. From the time of a decree that's mentioned here, to go back and the Jews can go back to their Holy Land, to Jerusalem, rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. Well, there's debate as to when that, whether it was Cyrus's decree or Artaxerxes' decree, but it goes all the way to 77s to the Messiah setting up his kingdom. The 69 weeks of sevens, 77 sevens, adds up to when Jesus came the first time. There's no Old Testament prophet knew there would be a delay between the first and second coming because of the Jews rejecting Jesus the first time. They didn't see that. And so there's the 70th week is the tribulation period, and that's what this is all about. And so that's why this book is so important. It gives you a lot of information prophetically and yet future for Daniel's time, and even this part about Jesus at the end of time has not even yet been fulfilled. And that concludes this lecture.